if that's okay with you, Claire. Perfect.
Yes, ready to go.
Awesome. Good morning to everyone who's joined us this morning for this book talk. My name is Keris and I'm the Arts Coordinator here at the Royal Overseas League, which is a not-for-profit membership organisation which has over 16,000 members worldwide. We are very lucky to have our beautiful London clubhouse, which is places for our members to eat, drink, relax and stay, but we are even luckier to have our amazing concert hall and exhibition space, which are the main stages for our arts programme, which has been a big part of Rosal life for over 70 years. I have the great pleasure this morning of introducing our author today, Clare McHugh, who is joining us from Washington, DC this morning. So sorry for that very early start. Before turning to fiction, Clare worked for many years as a newspaper reporter, magazine editor, and later a history teacher. She's written for publications such as the Wall Street Journal and the Baltimore Sun. A Most English Princess is her debut novel, and we are so excited to have you here with us this morning. We will be taking questions at the end, so do submit them in the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen at any time during the talk. Also, copies of her book are available online and at your local bookseller, so please go buy one. So that's all from me, and I'll pass over to you, Clare.
Thank you very much, Karen. I'm so pleased to be here today to get to talk about Vicky. That's the subject of my novel. Her full name on her birth in November of 1840 was Princess Victoria Adelaide Mary Louisa. She turned out to have a most, not only was she a very English princess, she was a person whose life was full of incident. She turned out to be a very valiant woman and the things that happened to her are not only interesting in and of themselves, and I'm going to speak about that, but they had a huge impact on the world that we inherited. And I'm going to talk about that as well. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes. I have a few slides to show, and then I would be delighted to take any questions, comments, and objections. The thing about history, and fictionalizing history, as I think the recent broadcast of the Crown proves, is that when novelists or screenwriters venture into fact, try to go behind closed doors and illuminate what the official record doesn't show, it is in part interpretation. I have made an interpretation of Vicky's life, although I have clung very, very closely to a wonderful resource that I discovered, and some of you royal fans might know about, which are her letters, the letters that she and her mother, Queen Victoria, exchanged over 50 years. These letters, which are now half in Windsor and the other half in a castle in Germany, are not only revealing of the personalities of these two very interesting, intelligent women, they are also testaments, witness statements to history. And when I was thinking about writing a book about Vicky, I read all the letters. They've been published in 5 volumes, although those letters that are published represent about only 40% of the existing correspondence. But when I was thinking about writing this novel, I read all these letters, and I used them as the emotional backbone of the novel. So in that way, I claim to be closer to what really, quote unquote, happened than other people who would sort of speculate more and try to put themselves in Vicky's shoes. I think it's very hard to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and imagine exactly what it would have been like to be someone like Vicky. However, that is the novelist's job, and armed with the letters, I did venture forth. Now, the interesting part is that, of course, Vicky's life began, as all of ours do, embedded in a family. And the fact that her family was a very famous family didn't change the fact that the dynamics of family life had a huge impact on the person that she became. So I want to start my discussion of Vicky by putting up this famous portrait of from 1846 of Vicky's family. At the center, of course, you will recognize her parents, her mother, Queen Victoria, on the left, and her father, Prince Albert, on the right. We're going to talk a little bit more about Prince Albert in a minute, but you all will remember that Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were first cousins. However, they did not meet until they were teenagers. Upon their second meeting, Queen Victoria really became quite besotted with, fell madly in love with her handsome German cousin, and she proposed to him, which was only right by the standards of the day, because she was Queen Regent at that point. She had a much higher status than he did. He was the second son of a rather not that important German prince. However, they got married, and 9.5 months after their wedding in February of 1840, Queen Victoria gave birth to her first child, who is Vicky. In this portrait, Vicky is the furthest to the right. And when Vicky was down to the right, overlooking the baby, when Vicky was born, I always think it's so very, well, sad that the first person who met Vicky as she entered the world was a bit disappointed in her. The doctor called out, "Oh, tisk, tisk, it's a princess." Very valiantly, Queen Victoria, in the midst of labor, was able to respond, "Not to worry, the next will be a prince." And really, I'd like to say that from the beginning, Vicky overcame the disappointment that both her parents did feel that she was not the longed-for male heir very quickly, because Vicky, from an early age, revealed herself to be a young girl, very precocious, clever, well-spoken, happy, responsive, and people noted that physically she looked very like her mother. But her father liked to say that Vicky had a mind like his own, very academic, very curious. The disappointment that the young parents felt at the sex of their first child could also be put aside pretty quickly, because a year after Vicky's birth, her younger brother, Albert Edward, the soon to be the Prince of Wales, was born, and the two children, only a year apart, were from childhood good friends. And then immediately, pretty much, Queen Victoria had another child, her daughter Alice, then a spare heir, Alfred, called Affy, and then another girl, Helena. You know, Queen Victoria, as we all know, was a very fertile woman, and eventually had 9 children. However, in this picture, as I said, that dated from 1846, at this point, the royal couple had 5 children. And Prince Albert commissioned this portrait of the family. It has to be said almost as a piece of propaganda. The photograph, the painting was exhibited widely in London at the Royal Academy before it was hung at Osborne House in the dining room. It's a large painting. It can be seen today at Buckingham Palace. It's publicly accessible when the palace is accessible. Now, Prince Albert had the painting done because he wanted this artist who did it, a man named Winterhalter, to project with this painting the image that Albert and his wife wanted the British public to have of the royal family. They wanted people to see the family not as some of Victoria's uncles and grandfather had been seen as, you know, not always following middle-class values. The Hanoverians lived wild. They had mistresses. They lived above their budgets. They were not family people for the most part, although some were. Now that Queen Victoria was on the throne, on her own with the help of the prince. Um, the prince felt that the royal family should be symbols of the best part of the nation, the virtues of loyalty and fidelity, living well within one's means. Of course, no one was fooled. Everyone knew that the royal family had plenty of money, but that really the goal of the family was to stick together and further the interests of the nation, and be virtuous. In that way, Albert, who had a great ear for the currents in social life, was right in step with this new age, which came to bear his wife's name, the Victorian age. So this was a royal family for that age, and was to be admired for its unity and virtue. But you can imagine when you look at this picture, and I in fact have Vicky imagining this, that of the 5 children depicted, one is favored overall. The young prince, the heir, called in the family Bertie, is the one closest to the center of power, right in the center of the picture. There he is with his mother wearing red. It stands out, doesn't it, a bit? And she, his mother, has her arm around this young boy in a very blatant symbolism. Okay, we're together. I'm the queen, and this will be the man. This will be the child who inherits my throne one day. And the spare, the young Affy, Prince Alfred, is there near his mother as well, where the girls are relegated to the corner of the picture and seemingly playing a maternal role. There is Vicky, the larger of the 2 girls, looking down at her sister, Princess Lena, called Lenchen in the family. Right next to her is Alice, her other sister. And they're a little maternal group there. And in fact, I think one of the messages of the painting is that these young princesses will be mothers of future royal princes, which it turned out that they were, to the advantage of history and to the disadvantage, which I will talk about a little bit. In the world that Vicky was born into, she was certainly royal, and she was in fact soon made the Princess Royal, but she was not the most important in terms of the world's eye of the children in her family. That honor went to her little brother, and that was a contradiction of the actual atmosphere in the family, where it was quickly established that Vicky was the cleverest and the bossiest. Let's put it, these are children we're talking about. These are not adults, and their relative strengths come out in different ways. But Vicky was a leader among her siblings, and the fact that she was the eldest, of course, made that an easier role to take on. But what was wonderful for Vicky was that she was recognized by her father, who set the tenor of the family, to be a young girl of ability, some beauty, and most of all, someone who could be trusted to take on the care of her younger siblings, and could be trusted to be brought out to meet all of her parents' famous friends. So she was a much, later in her life, she needed all the confidence she had earned at her parents' table, and her parents did give her that. They recognized Vicky to be someone who could rise to occasions. She also was fluent in 3 languages from an early age. English and German were spoken interchangeably in the family, and also she was instructed in French. She soon learned to read. She was interested, as her father was, in all sorts of science and industry, which were emerging in this age, in the 1840s. And finally, she became a very good reader and scholar of the ancient languages, and very familiar with English literature. So in a way, she was ideally prepared for a life that was given to her, and I'll explain what that is going to be. And she came out of a family environment where the outside expectation that the heir should be the leading child was conformed to, but she privately knew that she could best Bertie in anything. In fact, poor Bertie, we would probably describe the Prince of Wales today as someone with some learning disabilities. He had a lot of difficulty in the classroom, sitting still and absorbing all the information that his father wanted him to know. He was also not coordinated. It took him a long time to learn to ride. In any case, all the children looked up to Vicky as their leader, and Bertie was 9 years old before he realized that Vicky would not be inheriting her mother's crown, but he would. Came as something of a shock to the poor boy. I want to talk a little bit more before I go on with the next years of Vicky's life, to talk about the remarkable figure of her father, Prince Albert, here photographed in. This is a colored early photo of Prince Albert. As I said, he was the first cousin of the Queen. He grew up in Coburg, a place near Bavaria in southern Germany. He had a difficult early life because his parents separated when he was only 5. He never saw his mother after that. He was the younger son of the Duke of Saxe-Coburg. He would not be inheriting. His older brother, to whom he was quite close, would be the Duke, and he had to somehow find his own another life. It was quite early in his life when it was proposed that he be married to his cousin, but that was not a certain thing. The thing that really animated Albert's life as a teenager was his experience of traveling and studying in Bonn at the university there. Prince Albert was a wonderful scholar. He had a huge range of interests, and he was very good and responsive student. He learned a lot at Bonn, and he also loved university life where ideas were paramount, and he could live the life of the mind. Like many people of his generation, he was a fierce German patriot. It bothered him a lot that, unlike France and Britain, Germany, or the lands where people spoke German, were not a united country. There were more than 30 small dukedoms and kingdoms where German was spoken, but they were a fractured bunch of countries. Of course, there was the large Austro-Hungarian Empire, but that was an empire of many different kinds of people that spoke many different languages. In what we consider Germany today, it was just a mishmash of small states. And Albert, like many Germans of his generation, dreamed of a united Germany. However, and the revolution that came in 1848 somehow promised that maybe these countries would finally be forged into one. But many years of discussion and arguing and fiddling around in places like Frankfurt, it came to nothing. And so Prince Albert, when he moved to London, he faced a lot of suspicion. As you all probably remember, he worked hard to combat the negative feelings that people had, the suspicious feelings people had about this German prince, and he did a lot of wonderful things, not only for the royal family but for England in general. And he established himself. Someone said to me the other day, "Oh, he's like the Steve Jobs of 19th century Britain. He had his finger in all sorts of different technological pies." He was interested in technology, in the railways, and in the way that industry was revolutionizing British society. But of course, he was also interested in culture. He was interested in music. He was interested in art. And the duty that he took most seriously was being the Queen's husband and establishing a very stable and politically neutral royal family. However, it bears noting that as the Queen was so often out of action because she was having all these children, Prince Albert found a way to gradually have more and more influence and take on the role of the head of state that the Queen had. They said, well, they had side by side desks and they did it together. Well, often he took the lead. And he would say to her, oh no, now you say this, now you write this to the prime minister, or we should say, you know, that your position is this. And people would note that sometimes at dinner parties, they would hear Prince Albert whispering in German to his wife, oh no, now say this, or this person is more important than that person. So he had a, he was not a fading violet. He was somebody who knew he had a good brain. He believed that having a royal head of state was extremely important to Britain, to keep the establishment going, to keep political stability. And he was determined that he and his wife would do their part of the dance, of the political dance, in the most virtuous and honest way possible. So that was his main goal. And then he spent a lot of time also sorting out various institutions and promoting British industries and such. And then the third thing he did a lot of was thinking about the future for his children. He often despaired of Bertie and Bertie's lack of academic abilities and seeming slowness, but he gloried in all of Vicky's talents, and he spent a lot of time thinking about how her life could be best used. Essentially, it wasn't that he knew that he didn't want her to just stay in Britain and marry some nobleman in Britain. He didn't feel that this was a role worthy of her. And also he saw it as a waste. He thought, this is my clever daughter and we need to, you know, employ her in a way that helps the greater cause of what political freedom, because he is in what we would call a liberal in 19th century Europe. He believed, while he believed in monarchy, he also believed that the people's representatives, the parliament, had to have a role in any good European government. And so he cast his eyes over his homeland in Germany and it very quickly alighted on the idea that the most powerful of the German states, which was Prussia, Prussia had at that point was a kingdom based in the east of what we know of Germany. The capital was Berlin. But after the Napoleonic Wars, the Prussians had also been given vast, well, quite large and very valuable, it turned out, territories along the Rhine, including the Ruhr Valley, which in the Industrial Revolution turned out to be second only to the British Midlands in terms of its reserves of minerals and iron to allow the Industrial Revolution to go forward. So Prussia, always a military power, in the early 19th century was emerging also as a commercial power. And it occurred to Albert that he could send his daughter, marry her into the Prussian royal family, and then she could be part of what he thought were two inevitable developments: the creation of a modern Germany, and also the creation of a modern Germany that was a liberal democracy with a monarch like Britain. So, you know, you could never accuse Prince Albert of thinking small. He was a person who always thought big. And for his beloved daughter, he thought, well, you know, if she goes to Prussia as a princess and later the Queen of Prussia, she will play a large role in making what my fondest dream for Germany come true. So he began this scheme of his quite early in Vicky's life. What happened was that in 1851, when Prince Albert put on the famous exhibition a great exhibition in Hyde Park, in the Crystal Palace, one of the people, his most favored guests that he invited to the opening of this exhibition was a man named Prince Wilhelm and his wife, Princess Augusta, who were the heirs to the throne of Prussia. They had met before when Prince Wilhelm was in exile actually in Britain for a few years at the time, for a few months at the time of the 1848 revolution, which nearly overthrew the Prussian monarchs, who were called the Hohenzollerns. But they got to know each other at that time, and Prince Albert said to Prince Wilhelm and his wife, "Come to London for my wonderful exhibition, and please, please bring your children." The royal couple, the Prussian royal couple, had 2 children. The eldest, very conveniently, was a boy. He's called Prince Friedrich, and in the family he was known as Fritz. And he had a little sister, Louise, Princess Louise. At the time the children came with their parents, these Prussian royals' children were 19 and 12. Fritz was 19 years old. He was, of course, as all Prussian royals are, he was in the army. He was a military officer at that time. But otherwise, young Fritz was a very sheltered, very shy young man, but quite good looking, which people noted all the time. Blonde, Hamlet-like was the way somebody in England described him. You know, a little wistful, but military, with a military stance, and well-spoken. Very little English, but that wasn't a problem because the whole British royal family who were hosting him all spoke German, no problem. At that time, Vicky was 10 years old. And she was told by her father, "Now listen, Vicky, it's going to be your job to show Fritz and Louise around the exhibition because I'll be busy with other things." He threw them together immediately, the young 10-year-old Vicky and the 19-year-old Prince. There was nothing said overtly to Vicky, "Oh, this is your future husband." Prince Albert just left it to see if the young people got on. Well, indeed, they got on very well. Although nothing romantic was said at the exhibition, 5 years later, when Vicky, pictured here on the right, when Vicky was just nearly 15, she and her parents had gone to Paris for a state visit, and much was written in the newspapers about Vicky's very lovely appearance at a state ball at Versailles. And Fritz's mother, reading about this in the newspaper, immediately said, "Okay, Fritz, if you're interested in this girl," and he did remember her fondly, "get over there and see what's up." And Fritz went to Balmoral in September of 1855. Vicky, like I said, was 14, nearly 15. The castle, the residence at Balmoral, had recently been completed, and the royal family was in residence up there for a couple of months, as they often are in the autumn after this ball. And Fritz turned up, and the young people spent 2 weeks together, and he proposed. But Vicky, having been a little suspicious and worried at the moment of would she like her old friend again, quickly had also been very enchanted by Fritz's gallantry, his looks. He'd only gotten better looking, and they had a lot in common. They talked about books and about, although Fritz was not as well read as Vicky, he's a thoughtful person. He enjoyed German poetry, which is something she knew all about. They also rode out together. Vicky is always a very keen rider, and they rode out, and they had this little romance. And she accepted him when he proposed in a hill near the castle. And like I said, she was 8 weeks shy, more than that, sorry, really 10 weeks shy of her 15th birthday. While it's very hard for us to understand how her parents would be okay with this, they did, and they were, because they liked Fritz as well. The issue was really that they felt that it was such a great not coincidence is the wrong word. It was wonderfully helpful that Vicky and Fritz loved each other, and yet their alliance was also so valuable. All the parents agreed. Oh, Prince Albert and Queen Victoria really felt that, and so did Fritz's mother. Fritz's father was a little more on the fence, but here are these young people, so conveniently falling in love, and then also they can do so much good in Fritz's country. So yes, having thrown them together, Prince Albert and Queen Victoria could hardly say, oh well, you can't be engaged at such a young age. They did allow a private engagement, but they said to Fritz, listen, it's going to be 2 years at least until you two can marry. Vicky is still very young. She needs to grow up more. She needs to be educated and confirmed. So we can say within the family that she is engaged, but we're not going to announce it. And that was just as well. Because actually, when it was announced about a year and a half later, in May of 1857, after Vicky had been confirmed, and Fritz had come twice to see her, and those visits had gone quite well. Though Fritz was immediately very jealous of all the other men that were in the court, and was anxious that Vicky think of him first. And she did. It was a lot for a young girl to take on the interest and attachment of this older man. He by this point in 1856, he was 25. To her 15 and then 16. So when the engagement was in fact announced, there were howls of criticism both in London and in Berlin. Let's do Berlin first, since this is very salient to what happened to Vicky. Oh, why would Prince Friedrich marry an English woman when he could marry one of all the many admirable German princesses that are around? And why does he have to go abroad for a wife? And those Brits, they're so condescending to Prussians. They think their system and way of life is so much better. Why are we endorsing that view that British people are better by bringing in a British princess? And so there was a pushback. In London, the newspapers pointed out, it's funny because all of the affection that Prince Albert and Queen Victoria had developed in the British public came back and bit them a little bit here, because they were what happened were the newspapers saying, we're sending the wonderful Princess the Royal away from London to horrible Berlin where they're all a bunch of autocrats, and none of the constitutional values that she's been brought up with are respected. Is this really a good move? It's so interesting because Prince Albert had to come right out and say, listen, we wouldn't send our beloved, he was quoted as saying this, we wouldn't send our beloved daughter abroad if we didn't believe that she would be allowed to practice. He actually used this phrase, practice the constitutional principles to which she's been brought up. So from the beginning, the expectation that the marriage between Vicky and Fritz would be a marriage that enshrined a role for the monarchy, where power was shared with the very small and not very powerful Prussian parliament. The fact that they wanted to say, listen, this is going to be a new kind of royal couple, and it's going to be a new kind of royal couple because they're going to be power sharing, is remarkable, and came a little bit to grief, as we'll see. When people ask me, well, why did Prince Albert believe that democracy could be established in Germany where it hadn't really ever been before? The 1848 revolutions had brought about parliament, like in established a parliament in Prussia, and in other German states. But this was on very thin soil. This was not the tradition in Germany. And why did Prince Albert believe that this could be established? Well, I said, you know, think about how American leaders believed in the Arab Spring. They believed that if they, and in Iraq, and, you know, if we put in enough resources, if we send the right people, we can start a sort of new kind of democratic revolution. This is the kind of, this was the kind of idea that Prince Albert was under. He was thought, listen, that we just need the right people, and we can have democracy in Germany the way that we have it here in England. And it was a very idealistic idea, and I don't think a bad one, but you'll have to judge for yourself and read the novel and see if you think that it was a fool's errand on Prince Albert's part, or that he misjudged the situation. You know, historians can debate it. Anyway, back to this wonderful photograph, which was taken of Vicky and her parents on her wedding day in January of 1857. Oh, sorry, 58. I always get these dates wrong. 58. Vicky on the right looks quite calm, and her calmness on that day, it was a very cold day in London, was much remarked upon. She was 17 years old and 2 months. She is wearing a dress of lace with the symbols of the nations of the United Kingdom, and a lot of myrtle, a flower that was thought in German tradition to be appropriate for brides. Notice that her mother, opposite her, failed to stay still for the 3 minutes that it took to expose the plate. And she, Queen Victoria, confessed herself to be very nervous on this day, more nervous than on her own wedding day 18 years before. And I think Queen Victoria comes across in her letters to Vicky as more trepidatious and more worried about what the future would have for her daughter than Prince Albert. And I think on that day, there was a lot at stake, and Queen Victoria worried that she was sending her daughter somewhere where she couldn't really be protected, and she did, and that was probably true. There is Prince Albert in the middle, looking quite stalwart. None of these people are tall. It's thought that Vicky was about 5'1". And in her new home, her short stature was much remarked upon. That the German royals considered height a great sign of, you know, vigor and good breeding, and the fact that Vicky's appearance, that she was small and round, counted against her. It was very mean in that way. Throughout her life, Vicky felt that somehow she didn't quite look the part well enough. However, very happily, her husband, here he is on the right with her during their honeymoon at Windsor. They were photographed. This is one of the only photographs in existence of Fritz not wearing a military uniform. Here he is in proper 19th century garb, wearing what we Americans would consider a very Abraham Lincoln-like hat. The young royal couple were very devoted from the start. Not only during their engagement period, their sense of excitement at having discovered each other, and their mutual devotion is notable, not only among royal people of that age, but of people in general. This was a very, very strong marriage for as long as it lasted, until Fritz's death. And the thing about it was that they had complementary, they offered each other complementary emotional strengths. As I said in the previous slide, Vicky was always self-conscious about her short stature, her round and buxom figure. She didn't think it was quite regal enough. Fritz always thought she looked great. He was one of those husbands who had no problem being very reinforcing to her, putting those fears at rest. He thought she had a lovely face. He was always very into her in the modern parlance. They had a very, you know, it's interesting. I don't know if they ever realized that their love letters would be read by, you know, thousands of people. The love letters between Fritz and Vicky, and their very passionate statements to each other about how they longed, especially Vicky. Vicky was very candid about how much she craved Fritz's physical company. And those letters were uncovered and written about in a marvelous biography of their first son, the last Kaiser, which was published in the early years, about 20 years ago. I'm going to refer to this historian again. His name is John Roll, and he took those letters and showed how much they enjoyed a strong physical bond as well as an emotional one from their first days of their marriage. Now, what Vicky gave Fritz was part of the confidence that she'd been given by her own parents. Fritz's parents were not happy together. They were, neither of them were generous or particularly sensitive people. Fritz was bullied by both of his parents a bit and always told, well, you should be doing better. But Vicky always had lots of confidence in Fritz and in his strength and his good sense and his most of all his good intentions. She was the cleverer of the two of them, and the better educated. But she constantly gave him her emotional support and good counsel, and she admired him not only for his good looks, but for his steadiness, his devotion to her, he was not at all a vain person. He was, although a marvelous leader of men and a military strategist, he was also someone who was extremely good-tempered. And so they really suited each other. And at this moment where they're on the cusp of their new life, I can only look with some poignancy at this photograph, because they have no idea of what is lying ahead. So they were allowed to enjoy a honeymoon of 3 days down in Windsor by themselves before Queen Victoria demanded that she and the rest of the family come and join them. I think Victoria was a little worried that the honeymoon might not go well and wanted to be there. And she was very relieved to find that the couple was getting on very well. But anyway, they had a 3-day honeymoon alone, and then another week before they took off for Berlin, sailed to Berlin, which was 700 miles, and basically you could do the journey in 2 days, but they did it. It's hard to do it in 2 days. It took them another week to travel there. So in any way, a long way from Windsor. As soon as they got there, Fritz's family, while on the surface seeming to be quite welcoming, had a lot of snipey remarks to make about Vicky and Vicky's, the way she presented herself. It wasn't typical for royal princesses to have opinions in Berlin. And of course, Vicky had a lot of opinions about literature, about politics, about how things should be done. And maybe Vicky didn't have the best EQ, as we would say. Maybe she didn't always read the room well. But from the start, she was putting her foot in it that people found they couldn't really understand how she could be so assertive. And also, well, she didn't really look, as princessy as people should, and so there was a lot of sniping, and she didn't feel at all welcome. Fritz did what he could, but he was immediately back into military life, and they lived in a horrible palace upstairs. They were given Vicky's in-laws had agreed to refurbish a smaller palace down Unter den Linden, closer to the Tiergarten for them, but they only started the work late, even though there had been a long engagement. And so she and Fritz were basically given a sort of an old apartment that hadn't been used for 50 years, and had no running water, and it was dusty, and it had a ghost in it, and it was a nightmarish beginning to life in cold Berlin, far from her home. And she struggled to stay cheerful. She did resume her studies, but then, just like her mother, very soon after her wedding, Vicky was pregnant. And she was a very, very nervous new prospective mother, and Fritz, very protectively, did not allow the doctors to examine Vicky until labor had begun. It was a move probably made out of protectiveness and undue modesty. And what happened was, as soon as she was in labor, when the court doctor took a look at her, they realized that the baby was in the breech position, and that a normal delivery was going to be extremely difficult. And then, of course, this was Vicky's first delivery. So it was a fraught moment. They did bring in, after scrambling, they did bring in the expert from the University of Berlin, an obstetrical expert. And in the crisis, when Vicky could hear people discussing her death, essentially, oh, she'll never survive this, this doctor came into this crisis, and he was able to wrench the baby out of her womb alive. And she herself survived. And there was a huge rejoicing privately in the, Fritz, who had been was with her throughout, had said to the doctor, listen, I don't care about the baby, just save my wife. And when they got through it, and Vicky was okay, and the baby was seemingly okay, Fritz collapsed, weeping, into his mother's arms. So relieved was he that they had that the situation had been remedied. Only 2 days later did they realize that the newborn baby's left arm was not moving correctly. Indeed, the young baby, called in the family Willie, his name was Wilhelm, Friedrich Wilhelm, but Victor Albert, to use all his names, but he was Willie immediately in the family. They didn't realize that in the process of wrenching the baby out of Vicky's womb, the nerves between the shoulder and the neck were severed permanently. A condition that we know as Erb's palsy, a pretty, not frequent, but it does happen, birth injury. At the time, though, they had no idea what was really wrong with the baby, but it was a cause of extreme distress to Vicky that she had produced an heir with this kind of with a flaw. Fritz was much more like, you know what, it's going to be fine, and he's a beautiful baby, and it's a miracle that he survived, and look how cute he is, and don't worry, and but it spoke to something very deep in Vicky, I believed. And listen, I'm echoing other historians here. She herself could never be heir, right? Because she was a woman, and her job was instead to produce an heir, and then to have the heir that she produced be somehow not quite fit. The way that people in Germany already said that she was not quite fit, that her stature, that her attitudes, that her mode of being was somehow not quite right. To have that echoed and with something so tangible as a paralyzed arm in the young baby was, it was hard for her, and she struggled with it, and it was kept a secret for a long time. When she first kept it even a secret from her own parents, but when she went to England for her mother's 40th birthday, a few months after the birth, she did tell them that young Willie had this bad arm. And then they start in her parents said, well, we have to bring in experts, and neurologists in Berlin and in London did prescribe various treatments, electric current to the arm and crazy straps and things, none of which really made any difference at all. But they continued to pursue that. They went on, Vicky went on to have 8 children in all. And but her eldest, who we know as the last Kaiser, Kaiser Wilhelm II, remained her preoccupation for her whole life. Here is the young lad at age 10. You can see he's been given a pair of gloves to hold in his left arm, hand, to make that arm look longer. Because one of the circumstances, one of the symptoms of the nerve damage was that the left arm never grew as long as the right. Now, young Willie was in many ways did not let his handicap hold him back. And he struggled to learn to ride and do everything that Prussian princes were supposed to do. But for the most part, he did them. And he took very seriously his role. He was his father's heir. His father was crown prince by this time because Fritz's father, Wilhelm, had become, he became in 1861 King of Prussia. And Vicky and Fritz were crown prince and princess, and Willie was their heir. It was a bright child, not brighter probably than his uncle, Bertie, but had a very, how should we say, he had a very bolshy temperament, and he thought a great deal of himself, partly because his grandparents were always telling him how great he was. And perhaps because while he worked around his bad arm, he compensated for it psychologically, and he didn't want people to see him as anything less than the Prince of Prussia, ready to go. And another thing happened in Willie's youth that had a huge impact on his development as a person, and that was the longed for and much anticipated unification of Germany under Prussia, however, by a mode that Prince Albert never anticipated, and in fact did not live to see. What happened was that when Fritz's father became king, he struggled to run the country well and to get along, most of all, with Parliament. He believed that he was supreme warlord in Prussia. He wanted to reform the army when the Parliament would not give him the money to do that. He was in open rebellion in Trump-like manner. He disparaged the Parliament. He said, "I'm not going to do it this way. You can't tell me what to do." Other people, including Prince Albert, who was in his last year of life, said, actually, you do have to do what Parliament says. And Fritz and Vicky also said, well, we have to come to a compromise over the money we're going to spend on the army. King Wilhelm had no interest in compromising. And at that point, actually, Prince Albert died in the middle of this crisis, and it was extremely sad for Vicky, who was pregnant with her 3rd child, could not travel to Britain to be with her sick father, and then was not there for the funeral. And the loss of his counsel and the sense that he was there for her and for Fritz was a grievous, grievous loss. Meanwhile, in Prussia, the king basically said, listen, I'm going to look around for somebody who's going to help me run this government the way I want it run, and Parliament can take a backseat to my ambitions. And the king found the ideal man to work with, and you will all know his name, and his name is Otto von Bismarck, a magnificently clever and ingenious conniving even, I would use the word, Prussian aristocrat called a Junker. That's what the aristocrats were called. He had been a diplomat for Prussia for 20 years. He was a very conservative person. His main goal in life was to establish, to preserve in Prussia all the privileges of the aristocracy, to preserve a very strong monarchy, and to ensure the dominance of Prussia over all other German states. If there was going to be a unity of Germany, it was going to be Prussian-driven and Prussian-led. And through a series of 3 wars, one against Denmark over Schleswig-Holstein, one against Austria for dominance in Greater Germany, and one against France to establish the German Empire, Otto von Bismarck made it happen. He solved a problem that other Germans had struggled with for decades. And the way he did it was with blood and iron. He just rolled out those troops, which they funded. He basically told Parliament, we don't care what you think, and we will tax without your authority. And they did it. But once Otto von Bismarck showed an amazing success on the battlefield, the Prussian parliamentarians lined up right behind him. There was no tradition in Prussia of great democratic participation, and the triumphs that Bismarck brought about on the battlefield was enough to convince most Prussians that a little bit of autocracy wasn't so bad. And it's notable that Fritz became even more of a celebrity in Prussia for his exploits as a general. He was the most loved of the Prussian royal family from a military point of view because his men loved him. He was called Unser Fritz, our Fritz, because the troops believed that not only was he an excellent man of strategy, he cared about the men, and he took care that there was no undue slaughter. He was one of them. And in that way, the period of German unification that accompanied the first years of Willie's life, the unification period really starts in 1863 with the war against Denmark, and ends in 1871 at a time when young Willie is let's see, he's just 12. That period was a triumphant one for Fritz, despite his disagreements politically with Bismarck. It was a triumphant one for the entire Hohenzollern family, and that was the atmosphere in which Willie grew up and believed that he would be the heir to, that he too would be supreme war leader of the future Prussia. So that distorted his personality somewhat, and as did the adulation of his grandparents. The person he actually had the most trouble with, who didn't buy into all of this adulation, was his mother. Here she is. This is Vicky in 1870. She's just turning 30. This is the year of the triumphant last war against France that cemented the German Empire, that made her father-in-law no longer King of Prussia, but Kaiser, the German word for Caesar, emperor. At this point, she had 6 children. She's lost her father, which continues to be a source of sorrow to her, but she enjoys a very strong marriage with Fritz, and as well, she has a strong relationship with her mother, to whom she writes 2 or 3 times a week, thus establishing this huge correspondence, which I referred to early in my presentation. She lives in a castle most of the time, in the Neue Palace, excuse me, in Potsdam, outside of Berlin. She's a very competent member of the royal family in terms of she has lots of sponsorships. She got very involved early at this time in her life in nursing. She was inspired by Florence Nightingale. She never herself was a nurse, but she established a nursing corps for Prussia, and she also established several schools for young women. She was very interested in the education of young women. However, her preoccupation with her son and making her son the most, preparing her son for his life, brought her into conflict with the son, with Willie often. Although she admired Willie's talents, that he was smart and well-spoken and very bossy the way she had been. In fact, the two of them were quite similar in assertiveness. She didn't like his preoccupation with Prussian greatness, his interest in militarism, which she scorned, and she and Fritz spoke openly all the time about their great unease with the power of Otto von Bismarck, now Prince von Bismarck, as chancellor. They didn't like his methods. They noticed that he didn't care about a free press or free speech or freedom of religion, all things which, as good liberals, they cared about a lot. And they noticed that he basically controlled Fritz's father with puppet strings. Fritz's father could have dismissed Bismarck at any time, but he never did, because he was really pleased to let Bismarck run the country. They despaired at the way Parliament didn't assert its rights. And Bismarck, in response, isolated them and planted bad stories about false stories about their lack of loyalty. He joined the chorus of people who referred to her as de Inglaterrentin, someone who couldn't be trusted, a princess of a foreign land, an agent of a foreign land. So this was the 1870s was a time in Vicky's life where she came into her own as a royal lady who did a lot of good works, and also she vastly enjoyed being a mother, especially to her other children. Very sadly, she lost two of her children, one to meningitis and another to diphtheria. But she had this large brood. She was quite close to her younger daughters, and the 1870s was a period of great fulfillment for her. And she tried very hard to keep her oldest son on the straight and narrow. But the older he got, the more he rejected her ideas and Fritz's ideas, and went over to the more militaristic side of German life. And in fact, he used to say, "I found my true family when I joined the Foot Guards." And that happened when he was 20, when he was in the early 1880s. He really was estranged from his parents. But while they were upset by this, they thought, well, we have plenty of time to establish our authority and our ideas in Germany when Fritz's father, already almost 80, died, and we at that time Willie will be more grown up and will be understanding where we want to take this country. There's a very notable incident in 1880 and 1881. There was a lot of prosperity in the new German Empire. The establishment of the breaking down of borders only helped business. The Industrial Revolution fueled great wealth. And so Germany was on a high in the late 1870s and into the 1880s. But occasionally Bismarck would he ran the country in many ways very competently, and he started the first Social Security system, and universal health care, or there was a version of it started in Germany. However, he remained basically the dictator of the country, and dirty tricks were never beyond him. And one thing that he would do is, when it was politically convenient, he would fan the flames of anti-Semitism. There were Jews who lived in Germany, of course, and then there were many who came from Poland following the prosperity of the German Empire, establishing businesses. And the Jews were the target of a lot of jealousy and bad feeling. And every so often, when it suited him, Prince Bismarck would fan these flames. And this is the origins of modern anti-Semitism in Germany. And Fritz and Vicky were appalled by this, and were the most prominent Germans to say, we support Jews, and they are fellow Germans, fellow citizens. In a symbolic move, Vicky took over the chairmanship of an orphanage for Jewish girls, and Fritz and Vicky would go to synagogue, go to services in the Berlin synagogues at the height of the pogroms. Fritz dressed up in his uniform as a Prussian field marshal. They never stopped saying, this is insidious and evil, and we don't accept it. Unfortunately, their son and other members of the elite did not follow in their footsteps in this regard. Now, the greatest tragedy of Vicky's life, she had these smaller tragedies, the death of her father at a young age, and then Willie's impairment, and then his alienation from his parents. Nothing equaled the fact that Fritz, when his father was still on the throne, it was still Kaiser, in 1886. He was then 87 years old, and Fritz was a man of 55. Fritz fell ill with a cold that wouldn't go away. And after some months, it was established that Fritz had a throat cancer. And as it turned out, his father died. And by the time his father died in March of 1888, Fritz could no longer speak. The doctors had to remove his voice box, and that he did breathe through a cannula in his throat, but he had to write messages to everyone on paper to say what he wanted. And he reigned for only 99 days. So Vicky, who had waited so long to have the position in Prussia and in Germany that all her training had earned her, she enjoyed it for a very brief amount of time. And her son, after the death of Fritz in June of 1888, her son barely acknowledged this horrendous young death of this very noble father when he got on with being Kaiser himself. And it was a cause of huge agony to Vicky. Vicky's a very ebullient personality, but it took 3 years for her to really regain her footing after this terrible setback. She thought about moving back to Britain, but she didn't want to give up on Germany and didn't want to be seen to be retreating. And so she found a new life. Here she is as a widow. She found a new life by moving to Frankfurt. She built a castle that she named after Fritz, Schloss Friedrichshof, outside in Kronberg, outside of Frankfurt, and she established herself there. Her very silly son ignored all her advice, and then soon fired Bismarck and tried to run the whole German Empire himself. We know how that worked out. Vicky tried to find a new life for herself, and she did. She remained someone who was very interested in the arts. She herself was a very talented painter, and she traveled with a gay courtier who was her constant companion to Italy and to France to look for antiques for her home and to paint. She welcomed her younger daughters and their children to her house, to her castle. She visited Britain regularly. She and her mother continued to be very close. However, in 1900, in the spring of 1900, when she was 59, it was discovered that she had a lump in her right breast. And at that time, of course, they could do very little for people who had breast cancer. And she suffered for 18 months dying only 6 months after her mother died. Her mother died in January of 1901 in Osborne. Willie was there, and he pushed himself to the front of the deathbed scene as the oldest grandchild and held Queen Victoria in his arms when she died, and bragged about it ever since. Meanwhile, Vicky, who was too ill to travel, was in Kronberg, also suffering. Her cancer spread to her bones. The first thing that her brother Bertie did after he ascended to the throne in January of 1901, and he established himself, got things, the office in order, and he went out to see her. And it's a famous visit of the king to Kronberg, and it's the opening chapter of my novel, because it's very important for how Vicky is remembered. So I hope if you read the book, you will be interested in that scene. It's told from the point of view of one of King Edward VII's courtiers, a man named Fritz Ponsonby, who was actually named after Vicky's Fritz. Just as a concluding slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about the process of writing a historical novel. I have said that I was interested in writing a book that was in the scaffolding of truth. I had a personal reason for being interested in Vicky, in that not only had I studied in college German history, and my mother is British, and her mother grew up in Gosport, which is near Portsmouth, and was the place where the royal family would get on the boats to go over to the Isle of Wight, to their house at Osborne. On one occasion in 1905 is pictured here, where King Edward VII, on the far left, is being driven down to the docks, and you see Vicky's son, his nephew, the Kaiser, there in the carriage beside him. The man holding the reins is my great-grandfather, Henry Lampard, who worked as a coachman in the household of General Montgomery, who was the general in charge of the southern defenses of England at that time. This is a treasured family photograph, as you can imagine. And I always was wondering about, why was the Kaiser there with the king? Like, how were they connected? And when I started researching their connection, that's when I came across the figure of Vicky. After all, Vicky is the king's sister and the Kaiser's mother, and is the linchpin in the unseen presence in this photograph. And that was one of the inspirations for writing about her. But really the reason I wrote about her was because I found her so valiant, and such a modern figure who was used in an archaic way. She was married off for political reasons, and yet she made of her life and her marriage something really beautiful. And I think her story will be inspiring because of the way she sticks to her principles, the way she tries to maneuver in a new family, how she takes the legacy of her first family and tries to import it. Marriages are always any marriage is the union of one family culture with another. In Vicky's case, it just was writ large. Here is the cover of my novel, for those of you who have not seen it. This is a fantasy. This picture of this princess is not really Vicky, of course, it's a model, but that is the Neues Palace in Potsdam, where Vicky spent the happiest days of her life, and her marriage to Fritz. It's a big barn of a place, but she made it very homey. She welcomed a lot of diplomats and various foreign dignitaries, and part of the last section of my book, in which talking about Willie's childhood, an American figure, a man from New York, was taken as a child by his parents to be a playmate of Willie's, and I use his memories to write those last chapters. I do hope that you will try the novel, and I'm really happy to answer any questions if people have them.
Thanks, Claire. That was fab. If you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box below. I have one already, actually. How do you think history might have been different had Fritz and Vicky reigned longer?
Well, it's a really interesting question, of course, and it's the question that Fritz's early death always begs. I think the world would have been quite different. The fact that the enormous power of the German Empire in the middle of Europe was quickly was under the leadership of the very unstable Willie for so many years, did enhance trends in German society and politics that brought on the First World War. It would be too simplistic to say that Willie caused the First World War. But he was a factor in it and had a more cool-headed, reasonable, liberal person been on the throne from 1888 till, it's reasonable to think that, Fritz's father lived to be 90. If Fritz had lived to be 75, he would have been Kaiser right till 1906. I think the whole atmosphere and the tension between Germany and its neighbors, and certainly between Germany and England, would have been much reduced. And perhaps, you'd like to think that 20th century history would have been better. But counterfactual history is always it's a tricky ground.
Oh, got another one. Have you considered writing a novel about Vicky's equally interesting artistic and racy sister, Louise?
Yeah. Yes. However, here's a little bit of publishing gossip. I hear someone else is doing it.
Oh gosh.
I was too late. I am also attracted to Louise, but Vicky was my first choice among Queen Victoria's daughters because I'm the eldest in my family, and I have a brother who's just a year younger than me. So I could relate to the idea that it would be painful to be passed over as a lesser because I was a girl. And so Vicky's always spoken to me for that reason. However, Louise is a more exciting person in many ways, much less dutiful, and really explored her own personality and the possibilities of the age. She is the subject of a terrific biography by a friend of mine, Lucinda Hawksley. And now I hear someone who I don't even know, whose name, I'm sorry, I've forgotten, is writing a novel. And it makes my competitive spirit rise up. I would like to, I am thinking about writing about Alice, who is Vicky's other sister, who people in the League probably know as Prince Philip's great grandmother. Have I got enough grades? Let's go. Elizabeth is the great grandson, a great granddaughter of Bertie, who is Vicky's sister, Bertie, who is Vicky's brother, and Vicky's sister Alice is the great grandmother of Prince Philip. She had she wasn't as daring and racy as Louise. She had a sad life in many ways. But I am thinking about her. That's a great question. Thank you.
Cool. I think we've used up all our time this morning, but
I talked too much.
Very much. No, it was great. Thank you so much. And yeah, I will go buy the book. I'm going to go buy it. It sounds fascinating.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. It's so odd to talk into the void, but I trust that Vicky's life story engaged you, and I appreciate everyone coming. And thank you, Kara. See you later.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.